The night was cold, the wind cutting through the thin jacket wrapped around the teenager's shoulders. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, but their eyes were fixed on the wooden door in front of them. It had been their home for 16 years. But tonight, it was nothing more than a barrier, a wall keeping them out. The shouting match had been over for minutes now, but the words still echoed in their ears. "You're useless. You think you can make it on your own? Go ahead. Don't come back." The door slammed shut. The porch light flickered off. Just like that, the house that once held every memory, every bit of warmth, was gone. They stood there for a moment, waiting, hoping the door would swing open again, that their mother or father would step out, that someone would come running after them. But the house remained dark and silent. Tears burned the back of their eyes, but they refused to cry. Not here. Not now. The duffel bag over their shoulder felt heavier than it should, even though it carried only a few clothes, a toothbrush, and the last few dollars they had. It was barely enough to get through a couple of days, let alone a lifetime. With nowhere else to go, they turned and started walking. The streets at night were different than they were during the day. They were quieter, but that didn't mean they felt safe. Every distant sound, every car passing, every rustling trash bag, felt like a threat. There was no destination in mind, only a vague sense that they had to keep moving, to put as much distance between themselves and that house as possible. The bus station was closed. The shelters were full. And every store they stepped into looked at them with suspicion, as if they could sense the desperation in their eyes. Eventually, exhaustion won out. The teenager found themselves standing in an empty parking lot, staring at an old van. It wasn't theirs, not yet, but they knew the owner. A guy who used to do odd jobs around the neighborhood before moving away and leaving it behind. It hadn't run in years, but the doors were still unlocked. They climbed into the back seat, pulling the duffel bag close and curling up against the cold leather. It smelled of dust and rust, but at least it was shelter. At least it was something. They told themselves they'd figure it out tomorrow. Morning came too soon, sunlight piercing through the cracked windows. Hunger gnawed at their stomach, but there was no food, no money to waste on anything more than survival. The first day was spent wandering. Walking through the city, looking for anything, a sign, an opportunity, a way to get through the next 24 hours. They passed by fast food places, diners, grocery stores, each one filled with people living normal lives. People who had a bed to sleep in, a home to go back to. By the time night fell again, the reality of their situation started to sink in. This wasn't just a bad night or a rough patch. They were homeless. And there was no one coming to save them. The van became their refuge, their only safe place. But safety was relative. Every night, they feared someone might notice them, might try to break in, might take the little they had left. The nights were colder than they'd expected, and without blankets or heat, sleep was nearly impossible. The hunger got worse. At first, it was just an inconvenience, a dull ache that could be ignored. But by the third day, it was unbearable. Desperation led them to a gas station, where they stood outside, watching people go in and out, hoping for something, anything. That was when they met the old man. He was filling up his truck, eyes sharp but kind. He noticed them lingering near the entrance and called out, "You waiting for someone?" The teenager hesitated, then shook their head. The man studied them for a long moment before nodding to the gas station. "You hungry?" The question hit like a gut punch. Pride wanted them to say no, but their stomach had other ideas. They nodded. The man disappeared inside and came back a few minutes later with a sandwich and a bottle of water. He handed it over without a word, then leaned against his truck as they tore into the food. "Been on your own long?" The teenager swallowed hard, unsure how much to say. "Few days." The man didn't press. He just nodded again. "Tough world out here. Got anyone looking out for you?" Another shake of the head. The man sighed. "Look, kid. I ain't got much, but I've been where you are. You gotta be smart about this. People out here, they ain't always good. You stay in that van too long, someone's gonna notice. Cops, or worse." The teenager stiffened. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a small wad of cash, nothing much, but enough to last a few days. "Take this. Find work. Even if it's washing dishes, anything's better than starving." The teenager hesitated, then took the money. "Thank you." The man just nodded, then climbed into his truck. As he pulled away, the teenager watched until the taillights disappeared. For the first time in days, they felt something other than fear. They felt hope. But the road ahead was still uncertain. The money wouldn't last forever, and the streets were unforgiving. As they climbed back into the van that night, staring up at the ceiling, they made a silent promise to themselves. They wouldn't just survive. They would prove to everyone, especially the family that abandoned them, that they were worth more than being thrown away. Tomorrow would be different. It had to be. The night was long, cold, and restless. The teenager lay curled up in the back of the van, their body aching from the hard, uneven surface. The old vehicle provided some shelter, but it did nothing to stop the winter air from seeping through the cracks. They pulled their thin jacket tighter around themselves, but the shivering never stopped. Sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford. Every noise outside made their heart pound: footsteps on the pavement, the rustling of a plastic bag in the wind, the distant roar of an engine. They knew the streets weren't safe. Every night, they worried about someone breaking in, about being discovered, about what would happen if they were caught trespassing in someone else's abandoned van. Still, it was all they had. When the first light of morning peeked through the van's dirty windows, they forced themselves up. Their stomach growled, reminding them of their reality. The old man's generosity had given them one good meal, but the hunger was already creeping back in. And the money he'd given them, it felt like it was burning a hole in their pocket. They had two choices: spend it on food and risk running out of money in a day or two, or stretch it as long as possible. They chose the latter. The city streets were a strange mix of familiarity and distance. They had walked these sidewalks before, past these stores, these coffee shops, these people, but now everything felt different. The moment they lost their home, it was as if they had become invisible. People rushed past them, heads down, lost in their own lives. They barely spared a glance. They weren't a student anymore. They weren't a kid on their way home. They were just another nameless person on the street. The realization stung, but they couldn't let it crush them. Instead, they focused on survival. They needed food. They needed a way to make money. The first stop was a small diner on the edge of downtown. They walked in, heart hammering, trying to look confident even though they felt anything but. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee hit them like a punch to the gut. Their stomach growled so loudly they were sure the entire diner could hear it. The owner, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" They swallowed hard. I was wondering if you had any work." "Anything. I can wash dishes, clean tables, whatever you need." The woman studied them for a moment before sighing. "Kid, you look like you need a meal more than a job." Shame burned their face, but before they could say anything, she nodded toward a seat at the counter. "Sit. I'll get you something. But after that, you gotta find a real job, okay?" They didn't argue. Minutes later, a plate of scrambled eggs and toast was placed in front of them. The first bite was heaven, warm and filling in a way they hadn't felt in days. The woman leaned against the counter, watching them. "Where's your family?" They hesitated. "Nowhere." She didn't push. After they finished, they thanked her and stepped back outside, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. They had a full stomach, but they were still jobless. And they were running out of time. The search continued. They checked gas stations, grocery stores. Even a few small shops, anywhere that might be willing to hire someone with no experience, no resume, and no address. The answers were always the same. We're not hiring. Come back when you have an ID. Try somewhere else. By midday, their hope was wearing thin. But then, as they passed a car wash, they noticed a group of workers hosing down a mud-covered SUV. One of them, a guy in his 40s with grease-stained hands, caught their eye. "Need work?" he asked. They nodded quickly. "Yes. I'll do anything." The man shrugged. "Grab a sponge." Relief flooded through them. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the next few hours, they worked, scrubbing cars, drying windows, sweeping the lot. The water was cold, their hands ached, and their shoes were soaked, but they didn't complain. By the end of the day, the man handed them $30. "Come back tomorrow if you want more." They nearly cried. That night, they used part of their earnings to buy a cheap blanket from a thrift store. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They sat in the van, staring at the money left in their hand. It wasn't a fortune. But it was a start. For the first time since they'd been kicked out, they felt a small flicker of control over their life. The next few days followed the same routine. Work. Eat. Sleep. Repeat. The car wash job paid enough to keep them afloat, and they were careful with their money. They started recognizing faces, other workers, customers, the diner owner who gave them the free meal. They even made a friend, a guy named Rami, who worked at the gas station next door. Rami was in his 20s, had a thick accent, and a smile that never seemed to fade. "You live around here?" Rami asked one night as they stood outside the gas station, drinking cheap coffee. They hesitated. "Something like that." Rami nodded, as if he understood more than they were saying. "City's rough." "You need help, you ask, yeah?" The offer stunned them. It wasn't much, just a simple "I'm here if you need me," but it meant more than they could express. For the first time in weeks, they didn't feel completely alone. But the streets had a way of reminding you where you stand. One night, as they returned to the van, they noticed something was wrong. The door was wide open. Their heart pounded as they rushed forward. Inside, their things were scattered everywhere. Their duffel bag was gone. Their small stash of money, gone. Panic clawed at their chest. Someone had broken in. Everything they had fought for, everything they had struggled to hold on to, was taken in an instant. They sank down onto the cold pavement, fists clenched, heart hammering. For a moment, they wanted to give up. But then, through the anger and the fear, a thought surfaced. They had survived worse. They weren't going to let this break them. With nothing but the clothes on their back and a burning determination in their heart, they stood up. It was time to start over. Again. The van was empty. The few belongings they had managed to hold on to, the thrift store blanket, the extra pair of socks, the little bit of cash they had saved, were all gone. The only thing left behind was the icy feeling in their stomach and the realization that the streets could take everything in an instant. They stood in the open doorway of the van, their fists clenched. They wanted to scream, to cry, to find the person who had done this and demand their things back. But that wouldn't change anything. The streets didn't care about fairness. The world didn't owe them an apology. They had two choices. Let this moment break them. Or get up and keep moving. They took a deep breath and stepped away from the van. That life was over. That night, they found a new place to sleep, a bus stop bench, tucked into a corner where they hoped no one would notice them. They curled up under their jacket, shivering against the cold, exhaustion pressing heavily on their shoulders. But their mind wouldn't shut off. They couldn't keep living like this. The car wash job was something, but it wasn't enough. They needed more, a real plan, a real way to get off the streets and build a future. The thought terrified them. For so long, their only goal had been survival. But survival wasn't enough anymore. They wanted to live. The next morning, they went straight to the public library. Libraries weren't just for books. They were warm. They were quiet. And best of all, they had computers with free internet. They sat down at a station, cracked their knuckles, and started searching. They had no degree. No real job experience. No address. No phone. But they had determination. And that had to count for something. For the next few days, their life became a routine: morning, walk to the car wash. Work until their arms ached. Afternoon, go to the library. Search for jobs. Read about budgeting, survival skills, and ways to get off the streets. Evening, buy a cheap meal. Find a new place to sleep. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even comfortable. But it was progress. They learned how to write a resume, even with almost nothing to put on it. They figured out how to open a free bank account. They discovered day labor jobs that paid cash at the end of the shift. Little by little, they started climbing out of the hole. One afternoon, while browsing job listings at the library, they overheard a conversation at the front desk. A restaurant manager was speaking with the librarian, complaining about how hard it was to find reliable dishwashers. Their heart pounded. This was their chance. They jumped up, walked over, and before they could lose their nerve, said, "I can do it." The manager looked them up and down, skeptical. "You ever worked in a kitchen before?" "No," they admitted. "But I work hard. I learn fast. And I need a job." The manager raised an eyebrow. "You got an address?" They hesitated. I'm between places right now." The man sighed. "Kid, I can't have someone just walking off the street." Their stomach twisted. But then the librarian, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "James, give them a chance. What's the worst that could happen?" The manager sighed again. Then nodded. "Fine. Be here tomorrow morning. 5 a.m. If you're late, don't bother coming back." They barely held back a shout of victory. They had done it. A real job. A real chance. A real step forward. The first shift was brutal. They had never worked so hard in their life. The kitchen was hot, the air thick with the smell of grease and sweat. The constant noise of clanging dishes, sizzling food, and shouting chefs made their head pound. By noon, their feet were aching. Their hands were red and raw from scrubbing plates. Their clothes were soaked in soap and sweat. But when the manager handed them a real paycheck at the end of the week, it was worth it. For the first time since being kicked out, they had something real to hold on to. A job. A future. A way out. With their first paycheck, they did 3 things. They bought a cheap prepaid phone. No more missed job opportunities. They put half of it in their new bank account. They wouldn't waste a cent. They rented a spot in a hostel for the night. A real bed, a real shower. It wasn't much. But it was progress. And progress was everything. Weeks passed. They worked at the restaurant by day, studied at the library by night. They learned how to budget, how to apply for better jobs, how to plan for the future. They stopped thinking of themselves as homeless. They were in transition. They were on their way up. Then, one evening, they got a call. An unknown number. They hesitated before answering. "Hello?" There was silence. Then, a voice they hadn't heard in months. "Hey, it's me." Their breath caught in their throat. It was their mother. The woman who had thrown them out. The woman who had shut the door in their face and told them not to come back. "I heard you're doing okay," she said. She hesitated. "I was wondering if we could talk." Their chest tightened. All the emotions, the anger, the betrayal, the loneliness, came rushing back in an instant. But so did something else. A deep, burning question. Why now? Why, after all this time? They had survived. They had built themselves up from nothing. And now, after all the struggle, after all the pain, now their family wanted back in? Their fingers tightened around the phone. They had spent so long fighting to prove themselves. Now, for the first time, they had to decide, did they even want their family back in their life? The phone felt heavy in their hand, as if it carried the weight of everything they had been through. The voice on the other end, so familiar, yet so distant, made their chest tighten. "I was wondering if we could talk," their mother had said. After months of silence. After throwing them out. After leaving them to fend for themselves. Now, suddenly, she wanted to talk? They clenched their jaw, their fingers tightening around the phone. Why now? The words almost slipped out, but they held them back. A part of them wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tell her about every freezing night, every moment of hunger, every time they thought they wouldn't make it. But another part of them, the part that had learned to survive, to move forward, to build something out of nothing, wasn't sure if any of it mattered anymore. So they took a breath and forced their voice to stay steady. "Why are you calling?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then, their mother sighed. "Things have been difficult," she said carefully, as if choosing her words mattered now. "I've been thinking about you. About how things ended. And I miss you." Their stomach twisted. "You miss me?" they echoed. "Yes." Another pause. Then, softer, "I want to see you." They ended the call without giving an answer. For the rest of the night, they sat in their tiny rented room, staring at the wall, their mind racing. A few months ago, they would have given anything for this call. They had begged for this moment in the beginning, waiting for their family to realize what they had done, waiting for an apology that never came. But now? Now, things were different. They weren't the scared, desperate kid who had been thrown onto the streets with nothing. They had survived. They had built something. And they weren't sure if they wanted to let their mother, or anyone from their past, back into their life. Not after everything. The next morning, they went back to work at the restaurant. They threw themselves into the job, scrubbing dishes, wiping down counters, carrying stacks of plates until their arms ached. But the conversation with their mother wouldn't leave their head. By the time their shift ended, they had made a decision. They would meet her. Not because they missed her. Not because they wanted to make things right. But because they needed to know. Why now? The meeting place was a small coffee shop near downtown. They arrived first, their hands wrapped around a cheap cup of coffee, nerves buzzing under their skin. 15 minutes later, their mother walked in. She looked different. Older. More tired. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on them, and for a moment, she just stood there, as if unsure of what to do next. Then she walked over and sat down. Neither of them spoke at first. Then, finally, she said, "You look good." It felt like a joke. Like she was trying to pretend everything was normal. They didn't reply. She sighed. "I know you're mad." "Mad?" they said, their voice sharp. "You kicked me out." Her eyes flickered with something, guilt? Pain? It was hard to tell. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said softly. "You were acting out. You weren't listening. I thought, maybe you needed to learn the hard way." Their stomach twisted. "So you threw me onto the streets?" She flinched. "I didn't think it would be like that. I thought you'd come back. I thought." She trailed off, looking down at her hands. "I didn't know." They exhaled sharply. "You didn't care." Silence. She swallowed. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air between them. "Why now?" they asked, finally. Her lips pressed together. Then, after a moment, she admitted, "Things have been hard. Your father left. The bills are piling up. I need help." A bitter laugh escaped their lips. "So you don't actually miss me?" That's not true, she said quickly, but the look in her eyes told them everything. It wasn't regret. It was desperation. They walked out of the coffee shop before she could say another word. The cold air hit them like a slap, but they barely felt it. Their chest was tight, their hands shaking with something between anger and heartbreak. 4 months, they had fought to survive. 4 months, they had believed that maybe, just maybe, if they worked hard enough, if they proved themselves, their family would come back. But now they saw the truth. Their mother hadn't reached out because she cared. She had reached out because she needed something. Because she had nowhere else to turn. And for the first time in their life, they had power. That night, they went back to their small rented room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. They could help her. They could go back. They could be the person she needed now, just like they had needed her before. Or they could choose themselves. For once. For the first time. And as they lay back on the mattress, staring up at the ceiling, they realized, they already knew the answer. The weight of the conversation with their mother sat heavy on their chest long after they left the coffee shop. Even as they walked through the city streets, hands stuffed deep into their jacket pockets, their mind kept replaying the words over and over again. I need help. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I made a mistake. Not, I want to make things right. She needed help. And she had come to them, not because she cared, not because she had changed, but because she had run out of other options. The thought burned. For so long, they had dreamed of this moment. Of their family realizing their mistake, of them making amends. They had imagined a tearful reunion, an apology, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. But now, faced with the truth, they saw how naive that hope had been. Their mother wasn't reaching out because she regretted what she had done. She was reaching out because she needed something from them. And for the first time, they weren't willing to give it. That night, they lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of their small rented room, exhaustion pulling at their bones. But they couldn't sleep. Because now, for the first time, they had to make a real choice. 4 months, survival had been their only goal. They had been so focused on keeping their head above water that they hadn't stopped to think about what came next. Now, they had money in the bank. A steady job. A roof over their head. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. And they had to decide what kind of life they wanted to build. The next morning, they made a plan. They weren't just going to keep working. They were going to move up. They increased their hours at the restaurant, taking every shift they could get. When the manager mentioned an opening for a line cook, they jumped at the chance, even though they had no experience, even though they had never cooked anything more complicated than instant noodles. I'll learn, they promised. And they did. They spent every spare moment in the kitchen, watching, listening, practicing. They burned their hands, ruined dishes, made mistakes, but they never stopped trying. And slowly, they got better. By the end of the month, they weren't just washing dishes anymore. They were cooking. But they didn't stop there. With every paycheck, they saved. They learned how to budget, how to manage money, how to think beyond just the next meal, the next rent payment. They went back to the library, spending hours reading about business, about success stories, about people who had climbed out of nothing and built something for themselves. And a thought started to form. Maybe they could do more than just work in a kitchen. Maybe they could own one someday. A year passed. A year since the night they were kicked out. A year since they slept in that freezing van, wondering if they would survive the next day. Now, they had moved into a small apartment, their own space, their own place, their own proof that they had made it. They weren't just a line cook anymore. They had been promoted. They had saved thousands of dollars. They had plans. And then, one evening, as they sat in their apartment, exhausted from another long shift, their phone rang again. The same number. Their mother. They let it ring. And ring. And ring. Then, finally, they answered. A deep breath. Hello. A pause. It's me, she said. I was wondering if we could talk again. This time, they weren't caught off guard. They weren't hopeful. They weren't desperate for answers. What do you want? They asked, their voice steady. Their mother hesitated. She sighed. Things have been bad, and I thought, maybe we could see each other again. Maybe we could fix things. They closed their eyes. You mean, maybe I could help you, they corrected. Silence. They could almost hear her shifting uncomfortably. It's not like that, she said quickly. I just thought, now that you're doing well, there it was. Now that you're doing well. Now that I can get something out of it. They had suspected it before. Now, they knew for sure. They had spent so long waiting for this moment. And now that it was here, they felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just clarity. They had built something. Without her. Without anyone. And they didn't need her now. I don't think we should see each other, they said finally. Her breath hitched. But, I needed you when I had nothing, they interrupted. You weren't there. And now, when I have everything? You suddenly want to be in my life again? That's not how this works. Her voice broke. I made a mistake. Yes. You did. Silence. For the first time in their life, they were in control. Not her. Not the past. Them. Take care of yourself, they said softly. Then they hung up. And for the first time in a long time, they felt free. That night, they didn't stay up thinking about the past. They thought about the future. Their restaurant dreams. Their next steps. Their life. A life they built. A life they controlled. And as they fell asleep in their own bed, in their own apartment, they realized something. They didn't just survive. They won. The morning after they hung up on their mother, the weight that had sat on their chest for years felt lighter. For so long, they had been waiting for an apology, waiting for closure, waiting for something that would undo the pain of being thrown away. But last night, they had finally understood the truth. Closure wasn't something they would get from their family. It was something they had to give themselves. And for the first time, they felt free. The next few months flew by. Work at the restaurant kept them busy, and their savings grew faster than ever. They had stopped just thinking about getting by, now, they were thinking about the future. They spent their nights at the library, studying business, watching videos about entrepreneurship, reading stories of self-made people who had turned nothing into something incredible. The more they learned, the more they realized, they didn't want to just work in a restaurant forever. They wanted to own one. And they weren't going to wait around for permission to start. One evening, as they were leaving work, their phone rang again. A number they didn't recognize. At first, they almost ignored it. But something made them pick up. Hello? A pause. Then, hey, it's me. Their stomach twisted. It wasn't their mother this time. It was their father. The man who had been just as responsible for throwing them out. The man who had been silent for over a year. Hearing his voice again felt strange, almost foreign, like it belonged to a life they had already left behind. I heard from your mother that you're doing well, he said after a moment. His voice was careful, measured. That you have a job now. A place of your own. Their fingers tightened around the phone. What do you want? A sigh. I wanted to see you. The words felt eerily familiar. Almost identical to what their mother had said. And that made their chest burn. Why, they asked. Another pause. Because. I regret what happened. I was angry back then. I made a mistake. And I wanted to talk. They exhaled slowly, gripping the phone so tightly, their knuckles turned white. They wanted to believe him. But they had spent too much time hoping for things that never came. "You mean you need something," they said flatly. "No, that's not," their father stopped, sighed again. "I just thought we could fix things." Fix things. As if he hadn't broken them in the first place. As if he hadn't abandoned them when they needed him most. A familiar ache rose in their chest. And yet, despite everything, some part of them still wanted to believe. Because no matter how much time passed, no matter how much stronger they became, a part of them would always be that 16-year-old kid, standing outside their home, waiting for someone to come back for them. And maybe, just maybe, this was that moment. Maybe their father really meant it. Maybe, for once, they wouldn't be disappointed. They agreed to meet. Not because they forgave him. Not because they needed anything from him. But because they wanted to see the truth with their own eyes. They met at a small diner. When their father walked in, he looked different, not just older, but worn down, as if life had been hard on him. His clothes weren't as neat as they used to be. His face was lined with exhaustion. For the first time, they saw something they had never noticed before. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't the all-powerful, unshakable man they had grown up fearing. He was just a person. A deeply flawed, deeply broken person. And for some reason, that realization didn't make them feel better. It just made them sad. They sat across from each other, the silence stretching long and heavy. Finally, their father cleared his throat. "You look good." They said nothing. He shifted uncomfortably. "How have you been?" They let out a short, humorless laugh. "How do you think?" Their father winced, looking down at his hands. "I know I messed up. I should have never done what I did. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted to see you. To know you're okay." They studied him, searching for any sign of dishonesty. But for once, they didn't see desperation in his eyes. They saw regret. Real regret. Not the kind their mother had faked, not the kind that came with strings attached. It was the regret of a man who had lost something important. And he knew it. They could have yelled at him. They could have demanded answers, demanded apologies. But they didn't. Because at this point, they didn't need them anymore. They had built a life without their family. They had survived without their father's approval, without their mother's love, without anyone else's support. And knowing that, truly knowing it, was more powerful than any apology could ever be. "I don't know if I can forgive you," they said after a long silence. Their father swallowed hard. "I understand. But I'm okay." His eyes met theirs. "I know." They stood up, tossing a few bills on the table for their coffee. "Take care of yourself," they said. And then they walked away. Not out of anger. Not out of resentment. But because they finally realized they didn't need his approval to move forward. They had already won. That night, they sat in their apartment, staring at their vision board, an idea they had picked up from one of the books at the library. At the center was a single goal: own a business. They smiled. Their past had shaped them. But it didn't define them. Their future was theirs to build. And they were just getting started. The night after meeting their father, they felt a strange sense of calm. For so long, they had been weighed down by the past, by anger, by regret, by the desperate need to prove themselves. But sitting across from the man who had once turned his back on them, they realized something. They didn't need his validation anymore. They didn't need their mother's either. They had built something. Without them. And that was more powerful than any apology, any reunion, any desperate attempt to fix things. The next morning, they woke up with a sense of clarity they hadn't felt in years. They had spent so much time surviving, pushing forward, proving themselves, that they hadn't stopped to think about what came next. But now, they knew. It was time to move on. The first step? making their dream a reality. They had been saving for months, living carefully, planning every move. But it wasn't just about money, it was about taking the risk. They walked into the bank, their hands only shaking a little, and sat down with the loan officer. "What can I help you with?" the woman asked. They took a deep breath. "I want to start my own restaurant." The words felt surreal coming out of their mouth. But the second they said them, something inside them clicked into place. This was real. This was happening. The process wasn't easy. They filled out paperwork, met with investors, pitched their business plan to anyone who would listen. Most people turned them down. They didn't have experience. They didn't have a business degree. But what they did have was determination. And finally, after months of work, of meetings, of exhausting nights spent planning and preparing, it happened. They got the loan. They found the perfect small space in the city. And they opened their own restaurant. Not just a business. A symbol. A symbol of every cold night they spent in that van. A symbol of every meal they skipped to save money. A symbol of every time they told themselves, "I will not give up." This wasn't just a restaurant. It was proof that they had made it. On their own terms. The grand opening was small, just a handful of people, a quiet launch. But the feeling of standing in their space, watching customers walk in, seeing people enjoy food they had created, it was unlike anything else. It wasn't just about making money. It was about creating something that mattered. For the first time in their life, they weren't just surviving. They were thriving. And then, one day, their mother walked in. They had thought this chapter was closed, that they had put the past behind them. But seeing her step through the doors of their restaurant made their stomach tighten. She looked around, taking it all in, before her eyes landed on them. A hesitant smile. "This is yours?" she asked. They nodded. She let out a soft breath, shaking her head. "Wow. I didn't know. I didn't tell you." Silence. Then, quietly, she said, "I'm proud of you. It should have meant something. Once, it would have been everything. But now?" Now, they didn't need to hear it. They had already proven themselves, to the world, to the people who doubted them, but most importantly, to themselves. She sat down at one of the tables, looking around. "I was hoping we could talk." For a moment, they considered saying no. But then they realized something. They weren't angry anymore. They weren't bitter, or resentful, or waiting for something that would never come. Because they had moved on. So they sat down. They listened. Not because they needed to. But because they chose to. And that was the difference. They didn't rebuild their relationship overnight. There was too much history, too much damage, too much time lost. But for the first time, it wasn't about fixing the past. It was about deciding the future. And they had the power to choose who stayed in their life and who didn't. Not out of fear. Not out of obligation. But out of strength. As they locked up the restaurant that night, they stepped outside, taking in the cool air, the quiet hum of the city. They thought about the kid they used to be. The one who had stood outside their home, duffel bag in hand, waiting for someone to come back for them. And they realized they didn't need anyone to save them. Because they had saved themselves. The life lesson: family isn't just blood. It's the people who show up. The people who stand by you. The people who see you at your lowest and still believe in you. Sometimes, that means the people you were born to. And sometimes, it means the family you choose for yourself. They had learned that the hard way. But in the end, they wouldn't have had it any other way. Because the struggle, the pain, the loneliness, the fight, it had shaped them into who they were meant to be. And that person was unstoppable.